Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the long list of potential Democratic candidates for the 2028 presidential election, and I will be ranking all of these candidates based on a kind of seven-tier list, ranging from excellent candidates to functionally unelectable. We'll be talking about each of these candidates, going a little bit in depth on all of them, and I'll be ranking them as of right now. The great thing about this list is that it's very early. It's May of 2025, so by my count, we still have 3.5 years until the 2028 election is held. And on the one hand, that does, I bet it'll be 2028 before we know it, just like it went from 2020 to 2024 before we knew it. But on the other hand, it's still far enough away where a lot of these people aren't going to end up running, and a lot of them might, something might change that makes them more or less electable. But that being said, we've got a number of candidates to talk about, so let's get into it. Now, I'm going to start out on kind of a more, I don't want to say controversial, but potentially, interesting note with AOC. And I think this is controversial because I'm going to put her in the insufficient category, ranging from insufficient to very bad, by the way. Now, this list is not a reflection of my politics. This is not a reflection of A, whether I am or am not a Democrat, and B, what candidate I would vote for or who I would want to be the president. This is purely based off electability, right? And so AOC has a very passionate fan base. A lot of people really like her. I have no doubt that she would get a ton of enthusiasm from a certain base, from a certain part of the country, specific wing of the Democratic Party. With that being said, the limited polling we have on her national approval numbers are not great. Republicans have attacked her as kind of a boogeyman before. I think it's pretty telling that she has not ran for statewide office in New York yet, even though that might happen in 2028. And in general, though I do think there's some, from an electability perspective, there are some things to like about AOC, with regards to the fact that she could potentially get turnout high among Democratic voters in a way that hasn't really been the case since Obama. I do not think she would do well with, working class voters in the Midwest. I think she would be a bad fit for most of the country, especially because she is objectively more left-wing than the country as a whole. America is not a particularly left-wing country in general. AOC would be the most left-wing candidate Democrats have ever run by a clear amount. And I think part of the reason Kamala Harris lost was because voters perceived her to be further away from the center than Donald Trump was, marginally. AOC would exacerbate that problem. I think she's closer to being very bad than she is to being average, but I will say I do think she has strong instincts. I think she is a good communicator, and maybe she'd do a little better than people expect on paper, but I'm comfortable putting her in the insufficient column. Amy Klobuchar. I actually, back in 2020, before I had this channel, was pretty high on Amy Klobuchar in terms of her electability. I'm a little lower on her now. I think Klobuchar would struggle to, get the turnout necessary for a Democratic victory. We don't have, in the 2020 primary, she didn't really have a lot of enthusiasm among Black or Hispanic voters, which are two demographics Democrats obviously need. The problem with Klobuchar is also that she's a little boring, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I think it can be an advantage or a disadvantage, but I think turnout would really be a problem for her. She appeals well to suburban voters. I think she'd put up, Biden-type numbers or better than Biden numbers, depending on the environment in a lot of the suburbs of the country. I think she'd do just fine with white voters, and I think that she has some strength in the Midwest, being from Minnesota and being an overperformer historically. With that being said, I do not think that she would be the strongest candidate. I think she'd be maybe average to good. Andy Beshear. Now, this is going to be the first excellent for me. Now, Andy Beshear kind of checks all the boxes. He's a moderate Democrat. He's from a deep red state. Republicans that have a pretty hard time attacking him as being, too left-wing for the country. He's a good communicator. He's won tough races before. I think is moderate enough, go back to the ideology, he's moderate enough to win, maybe moderate Republicans and moderate voters in general without giving up a ton of ground that would upset the left wing of the Democratic Party. A good example of this is transgender issues, which Democrats and generally the left of the country have lost ground on in recent years. Beshear is given the state he's in, Kentucky, a remarkably pro-trans rights governor. He's a remarkably socially liberal to progressive figure, and he's found a way to do that while also communicating effectively to pretty conservative voters consistently across the state of Kentucky. I think turnout would be the only concern for him. Again, Democrats, it is a prerequisite for any winning Democratic candidate to have strong support among black voters. The black voters are obviously the backbone of the party. Generally speaking, whoever black voters support wins the primary. Yeah, go look at Barack Obama 2008, look at Hillary Clinton 2016, Joe Biden 2020, right? So I think that could be a concern for him, but unlike Klobuchar, for someone like Pete Buttigieg, Bashir hasn't run the primary yet, and we don't really know whether or not he would be able to do well with black voters. So I think he could be very strong and excellent, but I'll be bullish and put him in excellent. Chris Murphy, I think, is very average to insufficient. I think you can kind of put him either place. He's an effective communicator. He's had decent messaging, but he's lesser known. He's from a pretty blue state, from the Northeast, not really a competitive part of the country. Could pretty easily be attacked as Connecticut liberal or just a wealthy coastal elite Democrat. I think he's borderline insufficient. I think he does want to run. He's made that clear, but I don't see how he'd get past a primary either way. Cory Booker, to me, I'll put him in the good. Now, Cory Booker is interesting because he ran in 2020, didn't last very long, but he now has a bigger name, especially that filibuster did him a lot of favors with the Democratic base. I think he's a good communicator. I think he speaks well in the sense that he kind of, I think a problem Democrats have had in recent elections is they haven't really had a consistent theme of their campaigns, and I think Booker has been good at that. He's younger, he's energetic. I think personality is a lot to like. He's also, he's from a state which is getting purpler, so that could be helpful for Democrats in New Jersey. We'll see how that goes this year. His weaknesses, and I think in New Jersey, we don't really have a ton of primary information on him because he dropped out in 2020 pretty early. But in New Jersey, he's historically done well among black and Hispanic voters, even in 2020. So a lot to like there. My concerns are that Booker is a pretty progressive politician. I think he's more left-wing the country in a pretty substantial way, so that could be an issue for him. Dean Phillips, I think, is also, I would say, insufficient in the sense that he doesn't really excite me in any way. I don't think that he is the best communicator. I don't think that he'd be a great debater. He has some good, he has some decent instincts. I think running against Biden in the 2020 primary, in 2024 primary was in retrospect a pretty interesting move. But he's not that well known, and just in general didn't really there was clearly a window for someone not named Joe Biden in the 2024 Democratic primary, and he was not able to kind of capture that, even though he was kind of the only one who was really trying. I'm going to put Elizabeth Warren in the very bad column. I know a lot of Democrats really like Elizabeth Warren. And she did very well in the 2020 primary. She was, there were points where she was leading in the polls. She stayed in until March, so clearly she was doing something right. But in terms of a national campaign against a Republican, she's very progressive. She doesn't really poll well. In 2020, she was polling against Trump in the swing states worse than Bernie Sanders, worse than Joe Biden. Not too great. She was probably the weakest front runner the Democrats had by January 2020. The other interesting thing about Warren is that in Massachusetts, where she is popular enough, right, she does not do well in elections. Her performances are consistently worse than other Democrats on the ballot. Just overall, not a ton to say about her electability that is positive. She hasn't really demonstrated any ability to win big margins the way, say, Amy Klobuchar has, or Andy Bashir has, or even Cory Booker has in New Jersey. So, I think she's a decent communicator. Obviously, she's a good debater, but the problem she has is that she has no electability track record. She's a lot more left wing than the country as a whole, and she also in the 2020 primary did not do too great with black voters. She did better than Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, but her demographic was either progressive voters or white suburbanites who are maybe more left leaning. So I'd put her in the very bad column. Gavin Newsom. Now this is an interesting one. I think there's some things to like with Gavin Newsom, there's some things to not like. I'd put him in the insufficient column. Now, this isn't. I think this one you can make the argument for anywhere between very bad and good. The pros: he is a good communicator. He's been willing to moderate on a lot of issues recently, especially after 2024. He's, I think, better at engaging with Republicans than most Democrats are. But on the other hand, he's the governor of a big blue state that is really not that popular in the country right now, right? Think back to the last election. How many Kamala Harris, California liberal attack, as did we get. Gavin Newsom would get that times 10 since he's the more recent governor of the state. And you also have to remember that Gavin Newsom in 2022, like, to be consistent, I am holding Elizabeth Warren accountable for her pretty objectively subpar performance in Massachusetts in her last Senate election. If you go to 2022, Gavin Newsom did not do well at all in California. He did not win re-election by a particularly large margin for a Democrat, given that it's California. So that makes me wary. Maybe I'd be willing to change my mind on this, but I think for now it's pretty clear he's going to go in the insufficient column. Gretchen Whitmer, this is a classic, very strong, isn't perfect, right? She's a little less battle tested than, say, someone like Andy Beshear is, because both of her campaigns for governor of Michigan, which is a swing state, give her credit for that, they've been against pretty weak Republican candidates. So she's kind of gotten lucky, I'd say. And that is to take away from I still think she would have won. She's clearly a popular governor. She does well enough to win over Republican voters, but she hasn't really run against like a really strong, Republican who people thought could win the race in the final weeks. So that's kind of holding her back. But again, governor of a really important state that Kamala Harris lost, does well consistently. Good communicator. She's a good debater. I think she has good political instincts too. Overall, very strong. Just short of the Beshear excellent tier, because she hasn't had the same battle testing that he's had. Jamaal Bowman, I think, is functionally unelectable. He is obviously a very left wing politician. He is a very I would say polarizing figure. He lost his primary, so I don't know why he's really on this list, but I think progressives might like him, and I understand why, but the fact that he didn't win his primary in a pretty blue seat shows that he's certainly wouldn't be the strongest candidate on the national stage. Now, Jared Polis, this is an interesting one. I'd put him in the average tier. He's kind of a high risk, high reward. He's a libertarian Democrat. He's been a popular governor of Colorado, but he's also taken a lot of positions that have upset Democrats, so that's why I don't think he'd get past a primary. Overall, he's like kind of, I'd say he's a pretty like middling communicator. He's like good enough, but certainly he doesn't have the level of like strength that someone like Kamala Harris had. And obviously Kamala Harris lost, right? So that's not all of it, but like comparing just kind of as like using her as like a benchmark, right? Harris was like, I thought a strength she had was that she was willing to be emphatic. I thought she conveyed her message really well to people that agreed with her, right? Jared Polis, I'm not sure if he could do that. I think he'd have a turnout problem coming from Colorado. It's a pretty blue state nowadays. He hasn't really been super battle tested. I think he'd be, average at best. And the more I talk about it, I think he could be insufficient, just given the fact that he's kind of lesser known anyways. J.B. Pritzker, this might be a hot take. I'd put him in insufficient. I would really say that the things people like about Pritzker are a little overstated, right? He, good communicator. He is well liked by Democrats because he's willing to use his own money to fund his races. He flipped back Illinois, the governorship, from being red to blue in 2018. With that being said, though, a couple things. First of all, Democrats, I think, over 2024, rightly thought to themselves that they have to change the way they govern because they're not popular right now. Kathy Hochul and Gavin Newsom in New York and California are two great examples of this. Democrats in big blue states are just not very popular among voters, especially in the bluest parts of those states, like the big cities like LA and San Francisco and New York City. And J.B. Pritzker kind of slid under the radar because Illinois is like a bit smaller than New York and California, but Illinois still had a pretty clear redshift in 2024. And it's also important to remember that J.B. Pritzker did not win election by a particularly impressive amount in 2022, despite the fact that he ran against a pretty weak Republican candidate in Darren Bailey. So electability-wise, not a lot to kind of run on there. And just in general, the fact that he's from a deep blue state that's been losing population shows that Republicans would have an easy time attacking him. Like maybe Chicago liberal doesn't hit as hard as California liberal or coastal elite, but it certainly does have a connotation that Republicans would like to run against. I also think that Pritzker kind of, right, like as a wealthier, and obviously Trump is kind of the literal guy disproving this, but Pritzker, like, I think Trump's the exception more than the rule because he's been able to kind of tailor himself to appeal to working class and less wealthy Americans. But the last very rich guy to run for president was Mitt Romney in 2012. And I know everyone who runs for president's rich, but like the last person who like really had that kind of as part of their baggage was Mitt Romney, and Barack Obama tore him down for that consistently. J.B. Pritzker might have the same issue. Who knows? Maybe it doesn't matter after Trump. I could be totally wrong on that, but I think Trump's been able to kind of, surprisingly like sidestep that. I don't think any other Republican or Democrat could do it the way he does. So that's why I'd be wary of Pritzker. He could be average, but I'm a little skeptical. Jeff Jackson, I'll put him in good. He is the Attorney General of North Carolina. He's certainly someone who has been able to communicate effectively. If you have ever, if you've ever liked a few political TikToks, you've probably seen Jeff Jackson on your feed. I think that's a good instinct thing to do. He's more well known than he really should be as like the attorney. Like most people don't know who the attorney general of their state is, but Jeff Jackson, I bet if you did a national poll, has the highest name recognition of any state AG. Maybe Ken Paxton, but it's a pretty close race. And so, just in general, good communicator, like I said, clearly has won tough races in states like North Carolina, right? He won as a Democrat in 2024 in a state that voted for Trump by 3 points. But at the end of the day, less battle tested. I think maybe long-term could be an interesting guy to look out for, maybe like in 10, 15 years. But he should run, I think the dude should run for governor or Senate before he tries anything for president, but I don't think he's going to anyways. I think Joaquin Castro is fine. He's a Democrat from Texas. He's been pretty quiet in recent years. He was kind of a guy who people thought was going to run in 2020. Maybe would be able to message better with Hispanic voters. Democrats been struggling with obviously Hispanic voters, especially in 2024, but lower profile in the past, half decade has kind of made him fade off the radar. John Fetterman, I think would be borderline unelectable. Now, this is, of course, a very controversial take. I know a lot of people think John Fetterman would actually be a very good candidate just because he's a working class Democrat from a small town outside of Pittsburgh. He won in 2022. Really did a very good job hammering Dr. Oz for being like he kind of flipped the script. I thought John Fetterman ran the most, I talked about this so much if you watched me back in 2022. John Fetterman ran the most Republican-coded Democratic campaign I've ever seen in my entire life. In a statewide race, of course. He literally was like, Dr. Oz, he's coastal, he's trying to buy out Pennsylvania. He doesn't understand us. He doesn't know us. He's not like us, right? Like stuff like that works well. That being said, Fetterman has really, really, a lot of stuff has come out about him since he's been elected senator. I'm not going to get into it, but it's really caused a lot of kind of like distrust among Democrats. I think him being one of the most pro-Israel Democrats in the Senate would hurt him among the progressive base, which has, become really upset by the Democratic Party's positions on the Israel-Palestine conflict, right? And so that coupled with the fact that Fetterman, really is weak from the base, but also has had a more controversial time in the Senate, I think makes him a pretty weak candidate. Coupled with the fact that he's kind of been able to switch positions and has been, there's been a few scandals about him coming out, like him being like a reckless driver and stuff like that. To me, not worth the baggage, and I don't think he'd run, but I think he'd be pretty dead on arrival if he was the Democratic candidate. Jon Ossoff, I mean, I'll say this, he's got a tough re-election bid ahead of him. He's got to focus on that first, although it's good news for him that Brian Kemp isn't running. But say he wins that, president, very strong candidate. He's young, he's energetic, he's dynamic, he's a good communicator. I think as a communicator, he's a bit weaker than Raphael Warnock. Like, I think Warnock, who is on this list, would probably be a bit better of a candidate. So we'll talk, spoiler, we'll talk about him later. But Ossoff to me would still be very good. Just my only hold back is that he's not from like the Midwest and isn't like a super moderate guy. Like I think Democrats, as of right now, this could change, but as of right now, I think Democrats should look for a more moderate candidate. Ossoff is kind of just a typical Democrat. I don't think he's very left wing, but he's a kind of in the middle of the party. Josh Shapiro, this is another very strong candidate. Governor of Pennsylvania, very popular, likely to win re-election pretty decisively next year, unless Stacey Garrity runs. But even then, I think he'd still win. Good track record, good communicator, was almost the VP. I think he should have been the VP nominee for Kamala Harris, by the way. I vouched for him on this channel. I said he would be the most electable. Again, I think the only thing with him is that, I think a lot of Democrats are kind of distrustful of him over his positions on Israel. Now, I actually think this is a pretty weird claim to have, given that Shapiro is not to me any more pro-Israel than the average Democratic politician, right? Like a thing that confused me was why Democrats would say, especially people on the left would say, oh, Josh Shapiro I want Tim Walz to be the VP nominee, not Josh Shapiro, because Walz is better on Israel. When Walz and Shapiro had functionally the same position on Israel and Palestine, both were, I think, in favor of Israel as a state, but were actually very critical of Netanyahu. And so that to me was a very weird thing. But regardless, the perception among the base, especially among the progressive left, is that Shapiro is not to be trusted. His bigger problem is the charter schools. He has kind of bucked the Democratic Party on charter schools, and it's been, making a lot of people on the more progressive wing of the party upset. So those are some issues, but I think that they could actually be blessings in disguise because, as we've seen, people perceive the Democratic Party to be too left-wing nowadays. Maybe getting attacked from the left wouldn't be the worst thing in a general election. Josh Stein, I think, would be good. He could be very strong, but he's been governor of North Carolina for like 4 months, so get back to me on that. Same boat as Jeff Jackson. Julian Castro is interesting. I think he'd be average, similar to Joaquin Castro. They're both kind of, they're both politicians that used to be kind of rising stars in the party, have been pretty quiet the past decade. Kamala Harris, this is obviously the $1,000,000 question. I think that she would be average to good for the Democratic Party. I'll put her in average. It's really hard to come back and win elections after you lost them. I know Donald Trump literally just did that, so it's ironic. But once again, Trump, the exception, not the rule. Harris, I thought, ran a pretty good campaign in 2024. It wasn't a lot she could do. As we saw globally, most incumbent governments got punished pretty badly in COVID. Like comparing the Democrats to other incumbent governments that ran for re-election after COVID, Harris was like one of the best performers, even though she still lost. With that being said, a lot of the attacks Trump had on her were effective. I don't want to go too much into it because I think we all know it pretty well, right? Like California liberal, the issue of her changing her positions to become more, to be more progressive in 2017 than to be more moderate in 2024. Good communicator, good debater. I thought her campaign was pretty good, but just overall, I think she hurt herself with a lot of the positions she took, the previous decade. Kathy Hochul, I think, would be very bad to functionally unelectable. I'll put her in there for fun. Unpopular governor, did not win by very much in 2022, might actually lose re-election in 2026, has really seen New York, the standing of the New York Democratic Party among the voters decline, and overall has really just not generated a lot of positive feedback or headlines from Democrats, whether they're in the center or on the left. It doesn't really appeal to either demographic. Laura Kelly, Laura Kelly's, I'd say, an underrated politician. I'll put her in good. I don't think she has any intention of running for president. I think she's going to retire after next year. But she's the governor of Kansas. She's a Democrat. She's been able to win in a red state like Kansas pretty, impressively 2 elections in a row. And she did it against a really strong Republican candidate in 2022. With that being said, low profile on the national stage. I don't imagine she'd have like amazing turnout among the base unless something crazy happens, unless she like proves to be like the greatest debater of all time in 2027. Who knows? But I think could be an effective candidate in terms of like arguing that she's moderate or in terms of communicating to voters who maybe switched to Trump in 2024. Mark Kelly, I think, would actually be average. Definitely someone who, and maybe I'll put him in good to be generous, but the pros that he's from a swing state. He's won elections in Arizona pretty impressively 2 years in a row, and he's a good communicator. He's a cool story. He's an astronaut. People like astronauts. Downside, really, what it seems to me is that the unions really harmed him when he was a contender for VP. Like the PRO Act, his opposition to a lot of pro-union progressive legislation in the Senate might have hurt him. That could be a problem. Mary Peltola, this is an interesting one. It'd be interesting to see someone from Alaska be the Democratic nominee. With that being said, she's not from a particularly big state, not really well known on the national stage. I think her like pro-gun positions could hurt her among the Democratic base. Might make her better, to deliver that moderate message to the voters. But I think on the national stage, I think within the Democratic Party, that pro-gun position is a pretty hard one to take and win. Obviously, I know I talk about moderating, but there's some positions that you take that will hurt you so much among the base, it doesn't matter who you win over anyways. So to me, Mary Peltola would be an interesting pick, but isn't going to run, and I think would have a really hard time in the primary as a result of that. Michael Bennet, another average one. He's, to me, generic Democrat from a pretty blue state. He's a good communicator. I'll give him that. I think he'd fare well in the debate, but I don't think he brings much else to the table. Obviously, I don't think he's bad. I just think he's kind of, very middling. Like Mitch Landrieu from I believe Louisiana. I don't know a lot about him. I don't know. I don't think he's gonna run for president, but I'll put him in the insufficient tier because he's so he doesn't really hold like a super important office and he's a lot less well known. Nina Turner, I think would be functionally electable to very bad, right? Like she's someone who in Ohio ran her statewide office, I think, in 2014 and lost decisively. Since then, she's been more local. She's upset a lot of Democrats because in 2021, she ran for Congress. She compared like voting for Joe Biden to like basically eating a bowl of poop. She said it more emphatically and more aggressively than I just did. But right, like she made a lot of Democrats angry with that. She's also just I think been very critical of the party's leadership at times that are often inconvenient. All that makes her, I think, unpopular among the base. Some progressives really like her, but I think beyond that, she's not. She isn't AOC in the sense that like she's been able to ascend to higher office and make amends with like liberal or moderate Democrats. She's just kind of been in the same spot for the past decade. Pete Buttigieg, I think, would be, average. He has to win something before he runs, and I know that's hard because he's from Indiana, and he's not going to run for anything in Michigan. But what I will say is that generally it's hard to go from mayor or cabinet to being president. He doesn't have like an electoral track record, but I think his bigger problem is that in 2020 he could have won that primary and he could have been the nominee in the first place had he been able to do better with black voters, and he pulled at like 0 to 1% with them. That's the biggest issue. That's the roadblock for him. It's that simple. He's a good communicator. I think a very good debater. A lot of people really like him. He's a rising star still, but like unless he can win over black voters, unless he can like meaningfully engage and get that turnout, he's not going to win a presidential election as a Democrat. Phil Murphy, I think, would be very bad. He's, again, overseen a New Jersey that has become a lot redder as, between now and when he entered office. Not a great communicator, didn't do very well when he ran for re-election in 2021. I don't think he's like scandal ridden. I don't think he'd like be a disaster, but he'd be bad. And I'm pretty convinced of that given how he did when he ran for re-election. Raphael Warnock, he's going to be, I think, the final addition potentially to the excellent category. He checks all the boxes. He's from a swing state. We've seen him get really good black turnout historically. Good communicator. I think he's one of the best, just raw speakers in the Senate. He's been able to win competitive elections before, and like Bashir, he's battle tested. You got to give it to him. He was a former pastor. I think he could, kind of touch in or, kind of like reach in and maybe have a more religious message, which Democrats have been lacking recently. Ro Khanna, I think would be average to insufficient. He's, from a deep blue part of the country. He's from the Bay Area in California. Decent communicator. He's relatively active on social media, but I don't think he went for president. I think if he did, he'd struggle to win over voters who aren't like progressive to liberal Democrats anyways. Roy Cooper, I think, would be a very strong candidate. He's older, which is a concern for him, especially after like Biden and Trump being like the two oldest presidents in a row. That's a thing voters are not liking, clearly. But he's from a swing state. He's a good communicator. Like I said, I know I'm saying that a lot, but these things do matter in like debates and reaching out to voters who aren't really super engaged. That being said, don't know how he'd fare in the Midwest, which is obviously Democrats need to win the Midwest to win elections. Ruben Gallego, I know a lot of people are low on him. I'm pretty high on him. He's a pretty battle-tested politician from a swing state. He outperformed Kamala Harris pretty substantially among Hispanic voters. That could translate to a good result in the election. And overall, I just think that in terms of the kind of like level of like trust I have in someone to like deliver a message, he's been aggressive. I think when it matters against Republicans, I think he's kind of like Pritzker in the sense that like he's really been able to emphatically argue against Republican policies while still being able to win over moderate voters. That's a good skill set to have, and I think that he's close to being excellent. Tammy Baldwin, I think she'd be very strong, to be honest. She's from a swing state. I know she didn't win re-election by a lot in 2024, but obviously Kamala Harris lost to Wisconsin, so her winning was pretty impressive. Overall, a lot to like about her, but I don't think she's running for president. I don't think that she'd be a super great national rally the troops kind of candidate. Tim Walz, I'm going to put him in average. I know a lot of people think he's going to be this great candidate. Overall, what I would say is that he is good among the base. Progressives and moderate Democrats like him. I think I don't think he'd lose in a landslide, but I don't think he's that great of a communicator. I didn't think he'd had that great of a debate against J.D. Vance, and I didn't think that he was the right pick for the right moment as VP. More importantly, the thing with him is that he's been, a pretty progressive governor of Minnesota. Obviously, that will help him with the base, but Democrats, I think as of right now, the evidence is that they have to moderate, and running Walz would not do that. He also has kind of like that, I hate to say it, right, but he has that like loser stench where it's hard to come back and win after you lost, whether or not it was your fault or not. I don't think it was Tim Walz's fault or Kamala Harris's fault, but both of them are associated with losing, and that is not a good position to be in. Now, finally, going to end on a good note here. Wes Moore, he's going to be very strong. Wes Moore, to me, is one of the best, he's one of the most prolific rising stars in the party. Popular governor of Maryland, has done well electorally, has really been able to, I think, convey Democratic messages better than almost anybody. And he's kind of like, I think that his best asset is that he's likable, he's charismatic, he's really, beyond like communicating and debating. I think he comes off very well, and Democrats have struggled with that. Right, Kamala Harris, despite the fact that I think she was a good debater, a lot of voters didn't trust her for some reason. Like, she didn't come off very well. Joe Biden, even in 2020, was not a good debater, and also, did not, really see that like impact his favorability ratings. When Biden ran against Trump in 2020 initially, he was very well liked. Right, so often being a good debater isn't a prerequisite to being like charismatic or well liked, but it can help. But I think Wes Moore is both. So. His only downside is he's from a deep blue state, but it isn't like Maryland isn't kind of like a boogeyman for Republicans the way California or New York is. So those are my thoughts. I know this is a long video, but we're going to be reviewing this every few months and talking about it. So right now, I think the two strong candidates, Andy Beshear and Raphael Warnock. I think that next up, ready to be moving into the excellent tier, would be Wes Moore and Ruben Gallego. So let me know what you all think, and I'll talk to you in the next one.